Kawhi is a trooper, man. Kawhi is a trooper. Kawhi is willing to put it on the line. The fact that he got hurt game one, people think that he's out, because he doesn't want to play. I think it just attacks his character.
I know what the initial reaction to this video is going to be.
Mike, you're a Laker fan. You want the Clippers to fail.
And although I would like the Lakers to make it to the finals, there's one thing that Laker fans and Clipper fans alike have wanted for the longest time, and that is for these two teams to face off in the playoffs. And it hasn't happened, at least not in my lifetime as an NBA fan. And it seems like, although this year it could have been a remarkable year for us to have some very juicy storylines, it doesn't appear like it's going to happen this year either. Before we get to the content, make sure you drop like, subscribe, and turn on our notifications to help the channel grow. Now that we get all that out of the way, cue the intro. Mic check 1 2 1 2. What's going on, everybody? For those guys that don't know how cursed the Los Angeles Clippers are, let's go back to the turn of the 2010 decade in order for you to understand. In 2009, the Clippers selected Blake Griffin with the #1 overall pick. Now, I'm not going to say the fact that they selected Blake Griffin over Steph Curry or James Harden was a curse. I think the true curse was the fact that the Grizzlies selected Hasheem Thabeet over James Harden or Steph Curry. But Blake Griffin would get hurt in the preseason during this season, and as a result, he would miss his entire rookie season. But once he did come back the year after for his rookie season, he was absolutely magical. But unfortunately, the Clippers would have some misses the offseason following. In the 2010 NBA draft, they would select Al-Farouq Aminu over Paul George and Gordon Hayward, but I think that's a little bit of an asterisk to the rest of how everything is. In 2011, something that isn't really talked about as much is the fact that the Los Angeles Clippers tried to get out of Baron Davis's horrible contract. And in order to do this, they traded their 2011 first-round pick to the Cleveland Cavaliers for Mo Williams and Jamario Moon. They held the 8th best odds to get the first overall pick, and they actually got lucky for once. They got the first overall pick in one of the deepest drafts in recent memory. I mean, this is the 2011 NBA draft that we're talking about, where we got players like Kyrie Irving, Klay Thompson, Kawhi Leonard, Nikola Vucevic, Jimmy Butler, for crying out loud. And yet, the Clippers traded this pick away to get out of Baron Davis's horrible contract. Well, this also was a huge curse because it affected my Los Angeles Lakers, because in order to make up for the void that they had at point guard, in 2012, they traded Chris Paul for Eric Gordon, Al-Farouq Aminu, and a bunch of other players. So they finally had a big three to build around. They would beat the Memphis Grizzlies in the playoffs in 7 games, but they would get swept by the San Antonio Spurs following that. In 2013, the Clippers went all in on a brand new, respected head coach in Doc Rivers. They would go 2-0 on the Grizzlies after Chris Paul hit a buzzer beater in Game 2. Blake Griffin would get hurt in Game 4, and then the Grizzlies would win 4 straight games to take the series. In 2014, the Clippers would beat the Warriors in the first round. They tied 2-2 with the OKC Thunder and were up 7 with 49 seconds left in Game 5. Kevin Durant would hit a 3. Chris Paul tried to draw a shooting foul on Russell Westbrook. It didn't work out. And after a 2-pointer and a 3-point shooting foul by CP3 on Westbrook, the Thunder won Game 5, and they would take the series after winning Game 6. In 2015, this is probably the most heartbreaking version of all. Clippers beat the Spurs in 7 games on a game-winning floater by Chris Paul, and then they would face the Rockets up 3-1 in the series. They would lose Game 5 on the road, and then would blow a 19-point fourth quarter lead at home in Game 6, and then lose Game 7. 2016, the Clippers would go up 2-0 on a young Portland Trailblazers team. Blake Griffin, Chris Paul, and Austin Rivers were all out of the series with injuries, and the Trailblazers would win in 7 games. In 2017, Blake Griffin would get hurt again in the playoffs, and the Clippers would lose 3 out of their 4 home playoff games to the Jazz. The CP3, Blake Griffin, DeAndre Jordan era ended with another Game 7 loss and a too early exit from the playoffs. And then the Clippers would trade Chris Paul to the Rockets in the offseason, and they would promise Blake Griffin to be Mr. Clipper, but would eventually deal Blake Griffin during the 2018 trade deadline. And I have to admit, man, they had a lot of pieces to build around. I mean, yeah, they didn't necessarily have a star player, but they still had Wilson Chandler, Danilo Gallinari. They definitely hit on their pick of Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. They have Montrezl Harrell, Tobias Harris. This team was good enough to make a push into the first round of the NBA playoffs. And even then, they took a loaded Golden State Warriors team to 6 games, and there actually was thought that they could actually pull it off. The Clippers were seen as one of the most popular destinations following the 2018 to 2019 season because they had an incredible supporting cast at this point. So what were they going to do next? How were they going to ensure that they capitalize upon this remarkable core? Well, enter Kawhi Leonard. You see, Kawhi Leonard already had a bit of a tumultuous past. His exit from the San Antonio Spurs was anything but beautiful, considering the fact that he came out of San Diego State University extremely raw, needed to slightly remake his shooting form, which Greg Popovich linked Kawhi Leonard to a shot wizard by the name of Chip England, who is credited for remaking Kawhi Leonard's form. And as a result, you saw Kawhi Leonard transform from a player that is kind of where Rui Hachimura is now to one of the best players in the NBA, a player that the San Antonio Spurs were depending on for the post Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker, and Tim Duncan era. Fortunately, in 2017, things got a little bit strange. You see, in the 2017 playoffs, Kawhi Leonard sustained an injury as a result of this dirty closeout by Zaza Pachulia. The San Antonio Spurs were crushing the Warriors in this particular game. They were up 21 points at a particular point, 76 to 55. Zaza would stick out his left foot while closing out on Kawhi Leonard. Kawhi would go down, the Spurs would end up losing, and this would essentially end the Spurs dynasty. The Warriors would beat the Spurs over the next 3 games, and this is when things would take a turn for the worse for Kawhi Leonard and the San Antonio Spurs. During the 2017 to 2018 season, Kawhi Leonard would miss the first 27 games of the season with a right quadricep injury. He would make his season debut on December 12, 2017 against the Mavericks, but he wasn't the same player at all whatsoever. He would play in 9 games between December 12 and January 13, and through it all, there would be a huge question about his commitment to the game. In March, the entire San Antonio Spurs team had a meeting in regards to Kawhi's injury. From the Spurs' perspective, they thought this may have been in Kawhi Leonard's head, and Kawhi felt a little betrayed at the fact that the San Antonio Spurs wouldn't take his injury seriously as a result of the lack of trust between Kawhi Leonard and the San Antonio Spurs at this point. And by the way, we can make a whole video on this era in Kawhi Leonard's career in of itself. It's just a brief overview. The San Antonio Spurs traded Kawhi Leonard to the Toronto Raptors as a result of their disagreement over the way Kawhi was rehabilitating his injury. Kawhi Leonard and Danny Green would get traded to the Raptors for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a 2019 first-round draft pick. Kawhi would go to Toronto, would win him a championship in his lone season in Toronto, and then became one of the most intriguing free agents of the 2019 offseason. You see, the Los Angeles Lakers had already swung a trade for Anthony Davis, and the question was, what were they going to do next? Were they going to try to create one of the most unstoppable big threes we've seen in recent memory, or were they just going to surround LeBron James and Anthony Davis with a ton of depth? Well, Kawhi Leonard was secretly meeting with the Clippers throughout this time, yearning to return to his home state of California, and he told the Clippers that if you are somehow able to acquire Paul George, then he would join the Los Angeles Clippers. This one trade changed everything in the NBA. It changed the trajectory of the OKC Thunder franchise as well, as Paul George would get traded to the Clippers for Danilo Gallinari, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and 5 first-round picks, which was unprecedented at the time, by the way. And as a result of this, the OKC Thunder entered their rebuild era, one of the most aggressive rebuilds I think we've ever seen in NBA history. Shortly after, they would also trade Russell Westbrook to the Houston Rockets, and the announcement was made by Adrian Wojnarowski. Within 5 minutes, the Los Angeles Clippers had both Paul George and Kawhi Leonard on their roster, and thus began one of the most exciting eras in Clipper basketball, but an era that was very disappointing to say the least. During the 2019 to 2020 season, as a result of the COVID pandemic and maybe some other things that we actually covered in our videos on this channel at the time, but for whatever reason, Pandemic P and Kawhi Leonard lost in 7 games in the Western Conference semifinals, and then would blow a 3-1 lead to the Denver Nuggets in the Western Conference semifinals, and then lose in 7 games. In 2021, the Los Angeles Clippers once again faced a 2-0 deficit to the first-seeded Utah Jazz. Kawhi Leonard was magnificent in the games that he played, but unfortunately, at the end of Game 4, as a result of a foul from Joe Ingles, he would sprain his knee. The Clippers would win the next 2 games, but unfortunately, Kawhi Leonard was done. He tore his ACL. He would take 2021 to 2022 off until he would make his return this past year on October 3rd, 2022. He would play in 52 games this past year, but you already know about the narrative that surrounds Kawhi Leonard. He load manages throughout the season in order to prepare for the playoffs. And to his credit, I could understand doing whatever you possibly can to make sure you're ready for the most intense basketball of the year. Even if it means losing out on 31 games, even if it means that team chemistry might be in flux, I could understand the philosophy of load managing in order to do whatever you can to be healthy for the playoffs. And to be honest, I thought the Los Angeles Clippers were ready this year. I mean, from top to bottom, I'm in love with their roster. I think they have one of the deepest rosters I've ever seen. They've made all the right moves in order to build a contender around Kawhi Leonard. And I don't blame them for being aggressive in acquiring Paul George, because what are you going to do? Just sit there and try to build around Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and this really deep team that you have? I totally understand it. I understand firing Doc Rivers and bringing in Tyronn Lue. As a matter of fact, I applauded that decision when they lost in the bubble. The Clippers went all in last trade deadline in the acquisition of Robert Covington and Norman Powell, and this trade deadline bringing back Eric Gordon, trading for Bones Highland, and also bringing in Mason Plumlee. And if that wasn't enough, they signed Paul George's best friend and former teammate, Russell Westbrook, who, to his credit, has been performing remarkably ever since Kawhi Leonard went down. And it just goes to show that Russell Westbrook still has that game in him. I just don't necessarily know if he could succeed being a second or third option on a team that's built around 2 or 3 other players. But now we're 3 seasons into the Kawhi Leonard era. Kawhi Leonard, without a doubt, gutted out the entire Los Angeles Clippers roster in order to come over to the Clippers to begin with. His contract expires in a year from now, and the Clippers roster is devoid of assets as a result of going all in on this core of Paul George and Kawhi Leonard.
Kawhi is a trooper, man. Kawhi is a trooper. Kawhi is willing to put it on the line. The fact that he got hurt game 1, trying to play through a game 2, people think that he's out, because he doesn't want to play. I think it just attacks his character.
In their defense, I don't necessarily think there's anything else they could have done about this. I mean, when you're a team like the Clippers, you're the little brother in Los Angeles. People aren't really respecting you. You have a brand new owner that wants to make a splash. Toilets! I don't blame that owner for coming in and saying, hey, we need to contend immediately. Hell, look at what Matt Ishbia did the moment he bought the Phoenix Suns. He swung a huge trade for Kevin Durant, ironically the team that is facing the Clippers in the playoffs in the first round. So I don't necessarily blame these owners for being aggressive for teams that have yet to win an NBA Finals. But at the same time, if we're going to play Captain Hindsight here, this entire era of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George has been an unmitigated disaster. And it seems like it's more of the same. Every time, every year for the past decade, the Los Angeles Clippers look like one of the best teams in the NBA. Each and every season, I say don't discount the Clippers. You don't want to face this team in a 7-game series. And it seems like, once again, when it counts the most, Los Angeles Clippers won't have their best player. I don't necessarily know what the future of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George is going to look like. Their contracts both expire following next season. So I'm assuming what the plan is to run it back one last time with this core. And if it doesn't work out at that point, it makes a lot of sense to try to trade Paul George or Kawhi Leonard. I wouldn't be surprised if they attempted to trade Kawhi Leonard and Paul George this offseason, just because they're still playing at a high level, but you don't necessarily know how much time there is for these two players to play together. Once again, Kawhi Leonard got injured during a very pivotal series versus the Phoenix Suns. He would play magnificently in game 1, but he would actually hurt his knee in game 1. He tried to play through it in game 2, but it added more strain onto his knee and his condition got worse. So he missed game 3 and 4, and the Clippers lost both game 3 and 4. And now the Clippers' future is in flux. We don't necessarily know what the future is going to look like for Kawhi Leonard and the Los Angeles Clippers. Should they trade these two? Well, I think it's actually a very reasonable thing to do, considering the fact that these two are going to be in trade rumors all of next year up until the trade deadline. So let me know in the comment section down below, what would you do if you're the Los Angeles Clippers? Would you keep Kawhi Leonard? Would you keep Paul George? Would you move on from them? Aside from that, I'm your boy Mike. I'm dropping our mic until our next upload.